The air inside the dressing room smelled like hairspray and expensive perfume, a thick scent that seemed to coat the back of your throat. It was the kind of smell that belonged to high-stakes events, places where careers were made or broken in a matter of minutes. The room was large, filled with long mirrors and bright lights, buzzing with the energy of 20 people who all believed they were the most important person in the building. In the corner, far away from the biggest mirrors, sat Alara. She looked at her reflection in a small handheld mirror she had brought from home. The dress she wore was a soft blue, simple in its cut. It wasn't covered in sequins like the others. It didn't have a designer label stitched into the collar. She had bought the fabric from a thrift store and spent 3 weeks sewing it by hand in her small apartment kitchen. Her hair was pulled back in a way that was neat but not flashy. To anyone walking by, she looked like she didn't belong. She looked like she had wandered into the wrong room by mistake. Across the room, the atmosphere was different. A group of women had taken over the main vanity area. They were laughing loudly, checking their phones, and surrounded by racks of clothing that probably cost more than Alara made in a year. The leader of this group was a woman named Vanessa. Vanessa was used to getting what she wanted. She had the kind of confidence that comes from knowing everyone in the room knows your name. She was adjusting a diamond necklace around her neck when she glanced over and saw Alara. Sitting quietly on her stool, Vanessa didn't say anything at first. She just looked. She looked at the blue dress, the simple shoes, and the way Alara was nervously smoothing out a wrinkle in the fabric. Then she turned to the 2 women standing next to her, a tall blonde named Tiffany and a redhead named Chloe. "Is that a joke?" Vanessa asked, her voice loud enough to carry across the room. She didn't lower her tone. She didn't care if Alara heard. Tiffany looked up from her phone and let out a sharp laugh. "I think she's serious. That dress looks like a craft project gone wrong." "Maybe she thinks this is a school play," Chloe added, turning her back to the mirror so she could look directly at Alara. "Honey, this is the national showcase. You can't buy a costume at a bargain bin." Lara kept her eyes on her small mirror. She felt her face get hot, a rush of blood burning her cheeks. She gripped the edges of her dress until her knuckles turned white. She wanted to say something. She wanted to stand up and tell them that she had worked 2 jobs for 6 months just to pay the entry fee. She wanted to tell them that her dress was made with love and care, not just bought with a credit card. But the words stuck in her throat. She knew that if she spoke, her voice would shake, and that would only make it worse.
"Ow."
"Don't look now," Vanessa said, stepping closer, her heels clicking sharply on the tiled floor. "But I think she's going to cry." "I heard her warming up earlier in the hallway," Tiffany said, scrunching up her nose like she had smelled something bad. "She thinks she can sing. It's almost cute, isn't it?" "It's pathetic," Vanessa corrected. She walked right up to Alara's corner and leaned against the wall, crossing her arms. "You know, they put everyone in the show for the first round. They need filler. It makes the real talent look better by comparison." Alara took a slow breath. She forced herself to look up. Vanessa was staring down at her with a smirk, expecting her to crumble. "I am here to sing," Alara said softly. Her voice was steady, even though her hands were shaking. Vanessa laughed, a cold, short sound. "Sing? Is that what you call it? Listen, sweetie. When you get out there, try not to trip over your own feet. The judges have a short attention span for amateur hour." She reached out and flicked a piece of lint off Alara's shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be helpful but felt like an insult. "Just try to be quick about it so we can get on with the actual show." The other 2 women laughed as they turned back to the main mirror. They started talking about their vocal coaches and their plans for the after-party, ignoring Alara as if she were a piece of furniture. But the damage was done. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Filler, pathetic, amateur. Alara looked back at her reflection. She saw the fear in her own eyes. She saw the girl who had spent her whole life being told she wasn't enough. She remembered her mother telling her to be realistic, to get a regular job, to stop chasing a dream that was too big for someone like them. She remembered the landlords who knocked on the door when the rent was late. She remembered the empty refrigerator. She looked at Vanessa's back. Vanessa was shining, confident and perfect. She belonged here. Alara felt like a thief who had snuck in through a side door. Suddenly, the door to the dressing room swung open. A man with a headset and a clipboard walked in. He looked stressed, looking at a list of names. "Vanessa," he called out. "You're on in 10. Sound check." Vanessa immediately switched her focus. She grabbed her microphone, checked her makeup one last time, and gave a final, dismissive glance in Alara's direction. "Wish me luck, girls. Not that I need it." She swept out of the room with Tiffany and Chloe following close behind, leaving a trail of expensive perfume in their wake. The silence that followed was loud. Alara was left alone with a few other contestants who were too busy staring at themselves to pay attention to her. She felt the tears stinging the corners of her eyes again. It would be so easy to leave. She could just grab her bag, walk out the back door, and go home. She could make up an excuse about being sick. No one would miss her. The judges probably wouldn't even notice the empty spot in the lineup. She stood up and walked over to the large mirror that Vanessa had been using. Up close, Alara could see the high-end makeup containers scattered across the counter. She saw her own reflection next to them. She looked small. She looked tired. But then she looked into her own eyes. "Are you going to let them win?" A small voice inside her asked. It sounded like her grandmother, the only person who had ever truly believed in her. Her grandmother, who used to sit on the front porch and listen to Alara sing for hours, clapping her weathered hands with joy. "You have a gift, Alara," her grandmother used to say. "Don't you ever let the world take that away from you." Alara thought about the years of singing in empty subway stations just to hear the echo. She thought about the nights she spent writing songs instead of sleeping. She thought about the feeling of the music in her chest, the way it made her feel like she could fly when everything else in her life was dragging her down. Vanessa had the clothes. She had the money. She had the confidence. But she didn't have the hunger. Alara could see it in her eyes. Vanessa sang because she wanted to be famous. Alara sang because she didn't know how not to. It was the only thing that kept her alive. Alara reached up and touched the silver locket around her neck, a cheap thing that held a tiny picture of her grandmother. She closed her fingers around it tight. Now she whispered to the empty room, "I am not leaving." She walked back to her corner and picked up her bottle of water. She took a long drink, letting the cool liquid calm her nerves. She looked at the clock on the wall. 10 minutes turned into 5. Then 5 turned into 2. From somewhere beyond the door, the muffled sound of music started. It was Vanessa's performance. Through the heavy walls, Alara could hear the beat of the pop track and the crowd cheering. It sounded loud. It sounded energetic. Lara stood up. She smoothed down her blue dress. She checked her reflection in her small mirror one last time. She fixed a stray hair. She looked at the girl staring back at her. She didn't look like a superstar. She didn't look like a celebrity, but she looked strong. The door opened again, and the man with the headset stepped in. He looked tired. He looked down at his list. "Alara," he said, barely looking up. "You're next. Grab your mic and get to the side of the stage. Don't make us wait." Lara picked up her microphone. It felt heavy in her hand, cold and metallic. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the hairspray-scented air. She walked past the empty vanity where Vanessa had stood. She saw a lipstick tube left behind, rolled over near the edge. She didn't touch it. She walked toward the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sounds of the theater were getting louder as she got closer to the hallway. She could hear the announcer speaking, the crowd clapping. She stepped out of the dressing room and into the long, dark corridor that led to the stage. It was a long walk, a tunnel of darkness, with a bright light at the very end. She could feel the vibrations of the music through the floor. This was it. The moment she had waited for her entire life. They had mocked her. They had laughed at her dress. They had called her a joke. They thought she was just filler, background noise for the real stars. Alara tightened her grip on the microphone. A small smile touched her lips. It wasn't a happy smile, and it wasn't a sad one. It was the smile of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Just watch me," she whispered into the dark. She walked toward the light, leaving the shadows of the dressing room behind her. The girl in the blue dress was gone, and in her place walked a performer who was ready to show the world exactly who she was. The laughter faded away, replaced by the steady beat of her own heart. She was ready. The corridor stretched out long and narrow, a throat of darkness leading toward the bright, blinding stomach of the theater. The air here was cooler than in the dressing room, carrying the faint scent of dust and old velvet. Ilara walked slowly, her heels clicking in a lonely rhythm against the concrete floor. The sounds from the stage were muffled by the heavy black curtains that hung on either side of her. But she could feel the energy vibrating through the soles of her shoes above her. A television monitor flickered with a static-filled black and white image of the stage. She looked up and saw Vanessa finishing her song. The pop starlet was hitting her final pose, arms wide, smile blindingly white. Even on the grainy screen, Vanessa looked polished, expensive, and untouchable. The audience erupted in applause. Ilara watched the screen for a moment, seeing the judges nodding and clapping. It was a warm reception. It was the kind of reception that convinced people like Vanessa that the world was theirs for the taking. But Ilara knew something Vanessa didn't. A performance wasn't about the costume or the smile. It was about what you left on the floor when you were done, as she continued walking. A man in a headset stepped out from a side door. He held a clipboard and looked annoyed, checking his watch. He barely glanced at Ilara as he blocked her path. "You're the blue dress, right?" he asked, his voice flat. Ilara nodded. "Yes, I'm next," he sighed, looking her up and down. "We're running a little behind schedule. The judges are getting restless. Don't do a long intro. Don't talk to the audience. Just get out there, sing your song, and get off. And for heaven's sake, don't trip on the cables. We don't have time for a cleanup crew." He didn't say it to be mean. He said it because he truly didn't think she mattered. To him, she was just a pause between the real acts. A commercial break that nobody wanted to watch. He was already looking past her, ready for the next contestant to take the spotlight. "I understand," Ilara said softly. Her voice didn't waver. He moved aside, jerking his thumb toward a gap in the curtains. "Stand there. Wait for the announcer. And good luck. You're gonna need it." He snorted at his own joke and walked away. Ilara stepped into the waiting area just behind the heavy velvet curtain. It was a small, cramped space, packed with equipment and stagehands. On the other side of the thick fabric, she could hear the announcer's voice booming through the speakers, thanking Vanessa for her performance. The crowd cheered again. Then the music faded. Silence fell over the arena, but it wasn't a quiet silence. It was a heavy, expectant hum. Thousands of people shifting in their seats. Thousands of people checking their phones, whispering to their neighbors, waiting for the next distraction. Ilara closed her eyes for a second. She pictured the dressing room, the smell of perfume, sound of their laughter. Filler, amateur. She felt a small tremor in her hands. It was fear, natural and instinctive. It was the body's way of telling her that what she was about to do was dangerous. She was about to walk out alone and try to convince thousands of strangers that she was worth listening to. If she failed, the mockery would only get louder. It would confirm everything they had said about her. But then she thought about her apartment. The one with the peeling paint and the thin walls. She thought about the nights she sat on the fire escape, watching the city lights, humming melodies until her voice was hoarse. She thought about the feeling of being invisible, of walking down the street and having people look right through her. She had spent her whole life being the quiet one, the background character, not tonight. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed, vibrating through the floorboards. "Please welcome our next contestant, performing a unique interpretation of a classic song. Please welcome Ilara." There was a pause. Then came the sound of polite, scattered applause. It wasn't the roar that Vanessa had received. It was the sound people make when they are waiting for a waiter to bring them water. It was the sound of indifference. Ilara took a deep breath. She felt the air fill her lungs, pushing against her ribs, grounding her. She reached up and touched the silver locket at her throat one last time. Then she pushed aside the heavy velvet curtain and stepped into the light. The transition was disorienting. One moment she was in the cool darkness of the wings, and the next, she was standing under a spotlight so bright it bleached the color out of the world. She couldn't see the audience, She couldn't see the judges. All she could see was a wall of darkness in front of her, punctuated by the occasional glint of a camera lens or a pair of glasses. The floor of the stage felt vast and empty. She walked toward the center, toward the microphone stand that gleamed like a silver spear in the center of the spotlight. The heels of her simple shoes echoed loudly against the wood. Clack, clack, clack. It was a lonely sound. Out in the darkness, a low murmur began to ripple through the crowd. It was the sound of judgment. They could see the dress. They could see the lack of backup dancers. They could see that she wasn't holding a flashy prop. They were leaning forward, squinting, trying to figure out what the mistake was. Why was this girl on the main stage? Ilara reached the microphone. She didn't adjust the height. She didn't wave to the crowd. She didn't flash a fake smile. She simply placed her hands on the stand, her knuckles white, and looked out into the black void. She saw the judges' table. In the center was a man known for being brutal. He was leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest, a pen tapping rhythmically against his chin. He looked bored. He looked like he was already writing no. On his scorecard before she had sung a single note, Ilara felt a wave of calm wash over her. It was a strange feeling, separate from the fear. It was the feeling of a diver standing on the edge of a high board. There was no turning back now. There was only the jump. She closed her eyes for just a heartbeat. She let the silence stretch. She let the audience wait. She let the boredom and the judgment hang in the air like a heavy fog. She knew they were expecting her to fail. They were waiting for the first note to crack, for the pitch to be off, for her to be a disaster so they could turn back to their neighbors and say, "I told you so." But Ilara wasn't there to entertain them in the way they expected. She wasn't there to put on a show. She was there to bleed. She opened her eyes. The glare of the spotlight reflected off the microphone, shining into her eyes, but she didn't blink. She stared straight ahead, past the judges, past the crowd, into a memory that only she could see. She saw the hard times. She saw the rejection letters. She saw the mockery in the dressing room. She took a breath, deep and low from her diaphragm. The air vibrated in her chest, and then she opened her mouth. The first note didn't just come out. It exploded. It was a low, resonant sound that seemed to shake the dust from the rafters. It wasn't the thin, breathy voice of a nervous girl. It was a sound like a cello, rich and dark and full of sorrow. It cut through the murmuring of the crowd like a knife through silk. Instantly, the noise in the auditorium died. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was a sudden, sharp drop into total silence. The people checking their phones stopped. The judges stopped tapping their pens. The man with the headset backstage paused, looking up at the monitor in surprise. Ilara stood there, one hand on the stand, the other hanging loose at her side, and she sang. She didn't close her eyes to hide. She kept them open, staring into the darkness, letting the sound pour out of her, raw and unpolished and absolutely real. She began the verses slowly, her voice weaving through the silence with a precision that was terrifying. Every word was enunciated perfectly, every inflection carrying the weight of a lifetime of feeling. She wasn't just singing lyrics. She was telling a story. It was a story of pain, of resilience, of fighting to be seen in a world that wanted to look away. On stage, the light caught the sweat forming on her forehead. It was hard work. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. But as she moved from the verse into the pre-chorus, she could feel the atmosphere of the room shifting. The indifference was evaporating, replaced by something else. Shock dot. In the wings, the stagehands had stopped moving equipment. They were standing still, watching the small figure in the blue dress. In the dressing room, the contestants who were watching on the small monitor stopped talking. The smirk vanished from Vanessa's face as she watched the screen, her arms slowly dropping to her sides. Ilara didn't notice any of this. She was in her own world now. She was taking the hatred and the doubt that had been thrown at her, and she was using it as fuel. She was burning it up and turning it into something beautiful. The microphone stand was cold under her hand, but her blood was hot. She was finally, truly awake. The silence that had fallen over the theater was heavy, but it was the silence of awe, not boredom. Ilara stood rooted to the center of the stage, her hands still resting on the microphone stand. She had just finished the first verse, and the air around her felt charged. Like the atmosphere right before a lightning strike, she could feel a shift happening, a tangible wave rippling through the darkness where the audience sat. Usually at this point in a song, an amateur would rush. They would hurry through the notes, terrified that the crowd would get bored or start booing. But Ilara didn't rush. She understood that power wasn't just about volume. It was about space. She let the last word of the verse hang in the air for a heartbeat, letting the silence stretch until the audience was leaning forward in their seats, desperate to hear what came next. Then, she launched into the chorus. The sound that came out of her body didn't seem possible for a person of her size. It was a soaring, piercing belt that resonated off the back walls of the massive venue. She didn't just sing the notes. She attacked them with a ferocity that made her entire body shake. Her eyes squeezed shut as the melody took over, her head tilting back slightly, exposing the long line of her neck in the front row. A young man who had been looking at his phone dropped it into his lap. He didn't even notice it bounce off his knee. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes fixed on the woman in the blue dress. Beside him, a woman with a bored expression slowly sat up straighter. The skepticism was draining from their faces, replaced by a look of pure disbelief. This wasn't just good. It was visceral. It was the kind of singing that bypassed the brain and went straight to the chest. You could feel the vibrations in your own bones. Up in the judge's booth, the atmosphere had changed completely. The harsh judge, the one who had been tapping his pen impatiently, had frozen. His pen was hovering over his paper, but he wasn't writing. He was staring at the stage, his eyebrows furrowed as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. He had seen thousands of contestants. He knew every trick in the book, but Ilara wasn't using tricks. She wasn't doing runs to show off. She wasn't dancing to distract from her voice. She was standing there, utterly still, and dismantling the room with nothing but her talent. Ilara opened her eyes for the bridge, the climax of the song. The spotlight caught the tears that had gathered in the corners of her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. She used them. Her voice cracked slightly on the high note, not because she couldn't hit it. It was a beautiful, jagged crack that made the performance feel human and broken. It made it real. She hit the crescendo, her voice swelling to fill every corner of the hall. She was no longer the girl in the dressing room who was being laughed at. She wasn't the filler act. She was a force of nature. She remembered the way Vanessa had flicked the lint off her shoulder, and she poured that sting into the high note. She remembered the producer telling her not to trip, and she poured that frustration into the power behind it. Every insult, every doubt, every night she had spent feeling invisible, it was all pouring out of her in a torrent of sound that was absolutely unstoppable. The microphone stand vibrated in her hand. The sound was so loud, so pure, that it seemed to shock the very air. Backstage, the man with the headset was standing motionless near the curtain. He had seen a lot of people come and go over the years. He saw stars, he saw nobodies, and he saw everything in between. He had dismissed Ilara the moment he saw her dress. But now, he found himself standing with his mouth slightly open, looking at the monitor. The camera crew, usually rushing around and barking orders, had paused to watch. The sound engineer in the booth unconsciously adjusted the sliders, turning her up because he wanted to feel that sound hit him even harder. The dynamic of the room had flipped completely. Just 5 minutes ago, Elara had been the outsider. She had been the punchline to a joke made by people who thought they were better than her. Now, she was the one holding the power. She was the one commanding the attention of every single person in the building, in the dressing room. The television screen was glowing. The contestants who were getting ready for their spots later in the show had gathered around it. The whispering had stopped. Nobody was checking their makeup. Nobody was fixing their hair. They were all staring at the screen. Vanessa was sitting in a chair, one leg crossed over the other. She was watching the screen with a look that was hard to read. It wasn't anger anymore. It was confusion. She couldn't understand how the girl she had mocked the girl in the cheap blue dress was making a sound that Vanessa knew she could never make. No matter how many lessons she took or how much money she spent, it was a sound that couldn't be bought. It was a sound that had to be lived. On stage, Elara was reaching the end of the song. She wasn't tired. If anything, she felt lighter than she ever had in her life. The fear was gone, burned away by the fire of the performance. She felt a strange connection to the darkness in front of her. She knew that behind that wall of black lights, thousands of people were finally seeing her. They weren't looking at her dress. They weren't looking at her lack of flashy production. They were looking at her heart, laid bare on the stage. She took a step back from the microphone stand for the final phrase. She let the music strip down, dropping the power and singing softly, almost intimately. It was a brave move. It required her to trust that the audience was still with her, that they would listen to the quiet just as they had listened to the loud, and they did. The theater was so silent you could have heard a pin drop. It was a reverent silence, the kind usually reserved for holy places. Elara held the final note. It was a long, sustained, shimmering sound that seemed to float in the air like gold dust. She held it until her lungs began to burn, holding it past the point where most singers would have cut it off. She held it as if she were daring the world to look away. Then, slowly, gently, she let the note fade into nothingness. She didn't cut it off abruptly. She let it dissolve into the atmosphere of the room. Leaving a ghost of a melody hanging in the spotlight, she dropped her hands to her sides. She stood there, breathing hard, her chest rising and falling under the simple blue fabric. The bright light was still shining on her, blinding her, but for the first time she didn't want to hide from it. She stood tall, her shoulders back, waiting. The silence stretched for 2 seconds. 3 seconds, for it felt like an eternity. Elara couldn't see the audience. She couldn't see their faces. For a terrifying moment, she worried that they were silent because they hated it. The doubt tried to creep back in. Maybe she was too raw. Maybe she was too emotional. Maybe the producer was right and she was just a joke. But then, from the back of the theater, a single person started to clap. It was a slow, rhythmic clap. Then another person joined in. Then a whole section. Suddenly the silence shattered. It wasn't just applause. It was a physical roar that hit the stage like a wave. It started as a rumble and then exploded into a deafening wall of sound. People were on their feet. They were shouting, whistling, screaming. It was the kind of reaction that stars spend a lifetime trying to get. Elara blinked into the light. A small, genuine smile finally touching her lips. She didn't bow yet. She just stood there, letting the sound wash over her, accepting the moment she had fought so hard to reach. She had walked into the theater as a ghost, but she was leaving as a memory they would never forget. The roar of the crowd was not just noise. It was a physical weight that pressed against Elara's chest. For a long moment, she didn't move. She stood bathed in the blinding white light, her breathing ragged, her ears ringing with the echo of her own voice and the sudden, violent eruption of sound from the darkness. It felt like the floor beneath her feet was vibrating, shaking the dust off the stage boards. This wasn't the polite clapping you gave to a friend who tried their best. This was the sound of thousands of people realizing they had witnessed a miracle. It started as a chaotic roar and then settled into a rhythm. A rhythmic stomping and clapping that demanded she acknowledge them. Elara finally blinked. The brightness of the spotlights forcing tears to spill over her cheeks. She wasn't crying because she was sad. She was crying because the invisible wall between her and the world had just been shattered. She looked out into the black void where the audience sat and saw, for the first time, a sea of glowing phone screens. They weren't looking down at their laps anymore. They were holding up lights, thousands of small stars winking in the darkness. All focused on her. She took a trembling step back from the microphone stand and gave a small, clumsy bow. It wasn't a practiced, graceful bow like Vanessa's would have been. It was a bow of gratitude. As she straightened up, she looked toward the judge's table. The transformation there was even more satisfying than the crowd's reaction. The harsh judge, the man with the pen who had looked so bored earlier, was now standing. He wasn't just standing politely. He was leaning over the table, clapping his hands together hard, a look of total shock on his face. The pen was nowhere to be seen, probably lost on the floor. He was looking at her with a new kind of respect, the kind that is earned, not bought. The other two judges were on their feet as well, one of them wiping a tear from her eye. Alara realized she had done it. She hadn't just sung a song. She had changed the temperature of the room. She felt a warmth spread through her veins. Pushing away the cold fear that had lived there for so long, she turned and walked toward the side of the stage. Her legs felt like jelly, weak and wobbly from the rush of adrenaline leaving her body. The spotlight followed her for a few steps before cutting off abruptly, plunging her into the cool shadows of the wings. As soon as she stepped out of the light, she leaned against the heavy black curtain for support. She thought she might collapse. The adrenaline crash was hitting her hard, making her hands shake uncontrollably. That was insane, a voice whispered next to her. Alara turned her head. It was a stagehand, a young guy holding a large cable. He was looking at her with wide eyes, as if she were a ghost who had just walked through a wall. "I've worked here for 3 years," he said, his voice barely audible over the crowd. "I've never heard anything like that. You destroyed them, Alara." She managed a weak smile. "Thank you. Producer wants to see you," the stagehand said, pointing a thumb toward a bustling area backstage. Immediately, Alara took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. She smoothed down her blue dress, which was now sticking to her back with sweat. She walked past the rows of equipment, past the crew members who stopped what they were doing to watch her pass. Before, they had looked through her. Now, they nodded at her. Some even whispered "good job" as she walked by. The hierarchy of the theater had shifted in 4 minutes. The girl with the cheap dress was now the most important person in the building. She found the producer standing near a monitor, reviewing the footage of her performance. He didn't look annoyed anymore. He looked excited, the kind of excitement that smelled like money. He turned when he saw her. "Alara," he said, his voice brisk but much warmer than before. "That was unexpected. You really held the room." "I just wanted to sing," she said softly. "Well, you did more than that," he said, checking his clipboard. "The judges are demanding to speak to you before you leave the stage. Go back out there. They want to give you their comments now." Alara's heart skipped a beat. Usually the contestants stayed on stage for comments, but she had already left. The fact that they were stopping the show to call her back meant she had made history. She walked back out to the side of the stage, waiting for the announcer to signal her. The crowd was still buzzing. The announcer raised his hand asking for quiet, but it took a long time for the theater to settle down. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer said, his voice filled with genuine excitement. "Apparently, we aren't done yet. The judges have requested that Alara return to the stage for a special commendation." Alara walked back into the spotlight. The roar started up again instantly, loud and raucous. She walked to the center of the stage, standing in front of the judges' table. She felt small again under the lights, but this time, she knew she wasn't powerless. The harsh judge stepped up to his microphone. The crowd went silent to hear him speak. "Alara," he said, his voice booming through the speakers. "I have been doing this for 20 years. I have seen thousands of singers, beautiful voices, technical perfection, showmanship, but in all that time, I have rarely seen someone bare their soul the way you just did. You walked out here, and you let us see your pain. You let us see your fight. That wasn't a performance. That was an exorcism." The crowd cheered again. "We were ready to write you off," the judge continued, honesty ringing in his voice. Based on appearance, based on the lack of production value, we thought you were a joke. And you proved us wrong in the most spectacular way possible. You have a gift, young lady. Do not waste it. He held up his scorecard. It wasn't just a high score. It was a perfect score, a 10. He held it high for the cameras to see. The other judges followed suit, holding up their cards. Tense across the board, Alara felt the tears coming again, hot and fast. She pressed her hand over her mouth to stop a sob from escaping. This was what she had dreamed of, but the reality of it was so overwhelming, it felt like a dream. Thank you, she whispered into the microphone, her voice cracking. Thank you for listening. She turned to walk off the stage, but the announcer stopped her. And one more thing, Alara. The audience vote is open. But looking at these reactions, I think we can safely say you are going straight to the finals. Alara walked off the stage for the second time, but this time she didn't lean against the curtain to hold herself up. She walked with her head high, her shoulders back. She was exhausted, her throat felt like sandpaper, and her feet throbbed in her cheap shoes, but she felt alive as she rounded the corner toward the dressing rooms. She saw a group of people standing in the hallway. It was the other contestants. They were gathered near the door, listening to the show on the speakers. When Alara appeared, the talking stopped instantly. There was Vanessa, standing right in the middle of the hallway. Her arms were crossed over her expensive dress, her face pale. Next to her were Tiffany and Chloe. They looked at Alara, but they didn't sneer. They didn't whisper. They looked at her with a mixture of fear and envy. Vanessa tried to hold Alara's gaze, trying to find some of the insecurity she had seen in the dressing room earlier. But it wasn't there. Alara looked at her, not with anger, but with pity. Vanessa realized then that her designer dress and her diamond necklace meant nothing in the face of real talent. She had spent a fortune on her appearance, but Alara had spent her life on her art. And the difference was obvious to everyone in the building. Alara didn't say a word to them. She didn't need to gloat. She just walked past them, the blue dress swaying gently around her legs. The crowd of contestants parted like the Red Sea to let her through. No one blocked her path. No one laughed. She pushed open the door to the dressing room and stepped inside. It was empty now. The makeup was scattered, the clothes were thrown over chairs, but the bullies were gone. The air still smelled of hairspray, but to Alara, it smelled like victory. She sat down on her small stool in the corner and looked at herself in the handheld mirror. The face looking back at her was flushed, sweaty and tear-streaked. Her hair was messy, but the eyes were different. They weren't the eyes of a victim anymore. They were the eyes of a winner. She took off her shoes and rubbed her sore feet, a huge grin spreading across her face. She had walked in as a nobody, the girl they mocked. But she was leaving as the one name they would never forget. The silence of the room was peaceful now, filled only by the sound of her own heartbeat, steady and strong. The dressing room door clicked shut, but the noise from the theater outside was still vibrating through the walls. It wasn't just a hum anymore. It was a steady, rhythmic roar of people chanting a name. Alara sat on her small stool, clutching her handheld mirror in both hands, listening to the sound. It took her a moment to realize they were chanting her name. Alara. 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 The sound was muffled by the heavy walls, but it was undeniable. It wasn't the polite applause you gave to a runner-up. It was the sound a crowd makes when they have witnessed an upset. When the underdog not only wins, but shatters the expectations of everyone watching. She set the mirror down on the counter and looked at herself. The girl in the reflection looked the same messy hair, same simple blue dress, same tired eyes, but something behind the eyes had changed forever. The fear was gone. In its place was a quiet, steady light. She had spent so many years feeling small, feeling like she had to shrink herself to fit into the spaces people left for her. Tonight, she had taken up space. She had demanded it. There was a soft knock on the doorframe. Alara looked up to see the stagehand with the headset standing there. He wasn't looking at his clipboard anymore. He was looking at her with a kind of respectful awe. "Hey," he said, stepping into the room slightly. "The producer sent me. He wants you in the hallway. There are, reporters and some fans. Security is holding them back, but they want a picture. Ilara blinked. Fans. I don't have fans. You do now, the stagehand said with a small smile. Your performance is already trending online. People are going crazy for the girl in the blue dress. You coming? Ilara stood up. She smoothed down the front of her dress. It was still the same thrift store fabric, still the same simple cut. It didn't look any different than it had an hour ago when Vanessa was making fun of it, but the way the stagehand looked at it made her realize that the value of things wasn't in the price tag. It was in the story. I'm ready, she said. She walked out of the dressing room, leaving the solitude behind. As she stepped into the backstage corridor, the energy hit her like a physical wave. It was packed. Camera crews were setting up lights, reporters were holding microphones, and a crowd of people who looked like regular contest winners were pressed against the barriers. When she appeared, a cheer went up. It wasn't the thousands from the arena, but it was loud enough to make her ears ring. Flashbulbs went off in her face, blinding her. She felt disoriented for a second, reaching out a hand to steady herself against the wall. Ilara. Over here. Ilara, how does it feel to get a standing ovation? Ilara, what do you say to the judges who doubted you? A microphone was thrust toward her face. A reporter with bright red lipstick and a tight suit looked at her expectantly. You came out here with no backup dancers, no flashy lights, and a dress that caused quite a stir before the show. What made you think you could win this crowd? Ilara looked at the camera lens. She thought about the mocking whispers in the green room. She thought about the years of rejection. She thought about her grandmother telling her that her voice was a gift. I didn't come here to win a crown, Ilara said, her voice clear and steady, echoing slightly in the hallway. I came here because I have something to say. I think we spend too much time looking at the ball drum, the costumes, the lights, the hype hand. We forget to listen to what's inside. I just wanted to remind people that you don't need to be shiny to be precious. The reporter paused. Clearly expecting a generic thank you, she lowered her microphone for a split second, surprised by the depth of the answer. Well, the reporter recovered quickly. You certainly proved that tonight. The world is listening now, Ilara. What's next? Ilara looked past the cameras. She saw a few young girls standing at the back of the crowd, holding paper and pens, looking at her with wide eyes. They weren't the polished, perfect girls like Vanessa. They were normal girls. Girls who maybe felt like they didn't belong. I'm going to keep singing, Ilara said, a soft smile touching her lips. I'm going to keep singing until everyone who feels invisible knows that they can be heard. The interviewer nodded, impressed, and turned back to the camera to wrap up the segment. As the crew bustled around, Ilara stepped away. She walked over to the barriers where the young girls were waiting. They shrank back, shy as she approached. Hi, Ilara said gently, one of the girls. A teenager with glasses and a messy ponytail held out a crumpled piece of paper. Can I have your autograph? Ilara took the paper. It was a torn piece of a program. Of course. What's your name? Lily, the girl whispered. Ilara wrote to Lily, never let them dim your light on the paper, and handed it back. Lily looked at it as if Ilara had just handed her a bar of gold. Your dress is really cool, Lily said quietly. I made my own shirt too. Ilara reached out and touched the girl's shoulder. Wear it with your head held high. It's not about the fabric. It's about who is wearing it. As she signed a few more autographs, Ilara felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see the producer standing there. You're a star, kid, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I've never seen a turnaround like that. The network executives are already asking about a contract for the finals. You're not just a contestant anymore. You're the headline. I just wanted a chance to sing, Ilara said. You got more than a chance, the producer said. You took the stage and owned it. By the way, have you seen your friends from the dressing room? Ilara felt a tension in her chest. No. Did they leave? They're over there, the producer said, nodding toward a corner near the exit. Ilara looked. Standing in the shadows, away from the cameras and the lights, were Vanessa, Tiffany, and Chloe. They looked different now. The confidence had drained out of them. They were huddled together, watching Alara hold court with the reporters and the fans. They looked small. Vanessa met Elara's eyes across the crowded hallway. For a moment, the arrogance was there, a reflex. But then it flickered and died. She looked at Alara, really looked at her, and saw something that money couldn't buy. Vanessa looked down at her diamond necklace, then back at Alara's simple face. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just turned around and walked out the side door, followed closely by her friends. They were leaving the way they came in, loudly, dramatically, but ultimately forgotten. The cameras weren't following them. The fans weren't asking for their autographs. In this story, they were the background noise. Alara watched them go. She didn't feel angry anymore. She didn't feel the need to chase after them and gloat. She realized that the best revenge wasn't fighting them. It was succeeding so completely that their opinions didn't matter anymore. They were just people in a room, and the room had moved on. She turned back to the girls who were waiting for her. The stagehand handed her a bottle of water. "You ready to go? The car is waiting outside." Alara looked down the long corridor one last time. It was the same hallway she had walked down an hour ago, terrified, shaking, expecting to be humiliated. It looked different now. It was just a hallway. The monsters in her head had turned out to be just people, and the stage she feared had turned out to be exactly where she belonged. "I'm ready," she said. She walked toward the exit, the crowd partying for her. As she pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the cool night air, the sounds of the theater fading behind her, she took a deep breath. The city lights were twinkling above her, vast and beautiful. She opened her locket and touched the picture of her grandmother inside. "We did it," she whispered. Alara walked down the street, her simple blue dress flowing around her, her head held high. She wasn't the girl they mocked. She was the girl they would never forget. And the best part was, she was just getting started. The night was young, and for the first time in her life, the future looked bright. She didn't need their permission to shine anymore. She had her own light, and it was finally, truly free.